So hey everyone, some of you might have tuned in for my earlier stream where we just talked about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, I wanted to just jump on here quick and talk about it and play some of my stream for you because I did have quite a good structured stream and I wanted a couple more of you to see it. Also, one thing I want to say before you watch it is please watch the video before leaving me a comment of something you think I believe, because I can already see comments being like, you love NATO or you love Putin or something like that, maybe based on the title or the thumbnail or something like that. So I'm going to have timestamps down in the description. So if you just want to flick through and see my perspective on different parts of this thing, please feel free to do that. But I'm begging people, please don't leave just reactionary comments and assume what I think about this entire thing, especially people who will say like I'm a shill for Russia or a shill for Putin, because I might write in the thumbnail somewhere I'm anti-NATO, which I still am, but please watch the video to get my perspective. Thankfully, a lot of you guys have proved me right with the Hassan video that we can have mature conversations on this channel without freaking out at each other. So I'm hoping this video will be another example of that. Anyway, thanks for anyone who tuned into the stream originally. Please enjoy the video if you didn't, and let me know your thoughts down in the comment section. So first of all, to start with, I wanted to address this little thing. So I just tweeted this before I came on. I don't really understand people gleefully saying they were right about Ukraine and others were wrong. Even people in the Ukrainian government didn't think Putin would invade. This is a tragic event. Plenty didn't expect, not a time for gloating or point scoring. Because let's face it, many people who were right don't know much about the situation either. It's not like you were the rational one no one was listening to because you had expert knowledge that others didn't. So yeah, this is a problem on social media. Maybe you guys might not be as aware if you're not using Twitter, but because I obviously follow all the big left-wing creators and everything, it's just really bizarre to watch so much infighting and people really taking their position and being like, well, okay, Putin's not going to invade, and people are like, oh, Putin is going to invade. And what drives me crazy is I wasn't one of these people. Obviously, most people, I didn't expect Putin to invade. In what I said, I don't even know if I said it, but what I was thinking is Putin would annex eastern Ukraine, and that's it. And I still thought when I was up last night editing my Karl Kalinske video, I still thought when I heard about the invasion, I was like, even if they invade the whole of Ukraine, which this could still happen, I think it's just they want to annex eastern Ukraine and show NATO and the West this is what we will do if you try and encroach. Now, I don't think this whole conflict is just about NATO. But I do think people rejecting that are being a bit ridiculous. I know it's because Putin is this big Russian nationalist. If you listen to his speech the other day, it's clear this isn't just about NATO and stuff. But I still think that is in the conversation and people can't discount it. But then what it seems like now, obviously I don't know, it seems like they're trying to invade the whole of Ukraine and put in a puppet government, I don't know, in Belarus or something. But again, we don't know. If the Ukrainian military hold out long enough, maybe Russia would just have to annex eastern Ukraine and accept that. But again, I don't know what the overall goal is. What I thought is they want to completely take out the Ukrainian military and then annex eastern Ukraine. But then obviously, based on Putin's speech the other day, if you've already taken out the Ukrainian military, then maybe why would you settle for eastern Ukraine? But the one thing I would say is that Ukraine has a big history with guerrilla warfare against the Russians, against the Polish, against the Nazis, including people like the Azov Battalion, not them specifically, but there was plenty of fascist guerrilla movements during the Second World War who often collaborated with the Nazis, but also because they were nationalists, they also fought the Nazis as well. There was different groups who did different things. So I'm not sure about the geography of Ukraine, but since these guerrilla movements lasted 2 decades, I assume there's enough mountainous territory and forest to sustain a guerrilla movement effectively. So I don't know if Russia would want to deal with that headache. The thing is, because of how quickly these conflicts get settled, I was thinking about Armenia and Azerbaijan, and it's a very intense conflict, and then they have to negotiate and settle. The difference is, obviously, Azerbaijan was acting as basically a proxy for Turkey. Armenia is a proxy for Russia. Obviously, they have their own interests, but the reason they came to a negotiation is because they're being pressured by the big powers that support them to come to an agreement. Whereas in this case, Russia's doing it because they know they can get away with it. While we're sticking on the media side of this thing, I want to give people an example. So I'm going to switch it up a bit. So someone said that they're criticizing my title, saying like World War III and everything like that. And, you know, okay, fair enough. But I want to get to the point of comparing Putin to Hitler and the situation right now to Czechoslovakia in 1938 and, you know, Sudetenland and Munich. I don't think it's very helpful, and I don't think it's very accurate. Now, as I got a tweet on screen for you here, I wrote my master's thesis on how media framing affects public opinion towards war. So media framing essentially is you have frames that people know and you take that and apply that to other conflicts. So people understand what you say. If you say to people, Putin is Hitler, the invasion of not Eastern Ukraine, the whole of Ukraine now, the invasion of Ukraine is like Munich, and it's like the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Basically, because the similarities for people is that Hitler obviously said, I need to protect Sudeten Germans, I need to protect the ethnic Germans in Czechoslovakia, so let me go and do that. And that was a pretense for invasion. And that's like similar to what Putin is saying now, right? So that's fine. Like, that's a fair comparison. You can make that. But I think the frame of using Hitler and the Sudetenland, the problem with that is because what you're basically saying with that framing, like Nancy Pelosi saying here, the framing is, well, you know what comes afterwards. You know that no one stopped Hitler when he invaded Czechoslovakia, when he invaded Austria, and then eventually they did stand up to him when he invaded Poland. So if you do not stand up to Putin, then he's going to be the next Hitler. So he's not going to stop at Ukraine. What about like Romania? What about all these other places? Like, he's going to invade them all if you don't stop him now. And I think that language is quite dangerous, and it's like very warmongering, because you're using this framing to try and paint it like, if you do not do something now, and if you don't do something like we eventually did against Hitler, then you're going to have the next Hitler. Now, let's get into what I talk. So I'm basing this on my master's thesis that I wrote. So for me personally, the conflict I chose was the first Gulf War. Now, the first Gulf War was obviously when Saddam Hussein said that like Kuwait were taken away from Iraq's OPEC quota, and then he invaded Kuwait, and there was fears that he could have invaded Saudi Arabia, and that's why Operation Desert Shield happened before Desert Storm. Desert Shield was when they put US troops in Saudi Arabia, right? So for my master's thesis, what I did was I analyzed the New York Times' coverage of this event and like how they framed the conflict, right? So just reading some of my tweets. Saddam was an awful, awful man, but to drum up support for the war, he was constantly framed as the next Hitler. So Saddam Hussein was also called the next Hitler. If the US didn't stop him in Kuwait, then he would take over the whole of the Middle East, and they would even say this after Desert Shield, which protected Saudi Arabia. Obviously, they cared about Saudi Arabia because of the oil. So the key is to take something everyone understands as the frame and put the new villain into the frame. It ends the moral ambiguity, and it helps manipulate people into supporting war, because World War II, out of like all the human conflicts, is one of them that's like morally righteous, right? So if you're saying Putin is Hitler, Saddam Hussein is Hitler, when he invades Ukraine, when he invades Kuwait, that is what Hitler did in Czechoslovakia. So therefore, the alternative is, if you do not stand up to him, he will become the Hitler of the Middle East, or this will be a new Hitler in like Eastern Europe. But this is the problem, because it's not an accurate frame for the most part. So the media aren't going to compare Saddam Hussein to General Nasser from Egypt in the 1950s, who wanted to rally the Arab people against the colonialists and against Israel, or Saddam Hussein's hero Saladin, who was ironically Kurdish. So Saladin was the Muslim general who expelled the Christians from the Holy Land in the Third Crusade. And he united the Arabs, who traditionally in this period were always at war with each other, very factional. And he united them to create like a new Arab empire. So these are the people, like, obviously Saddam Hussein was like Arab socialist, Ba'athist. Not really in the vein of Nasser. I wouldn't compare them at all. Saddam Hussein was fucking evil. I don't think Nasser was evil. Obviously very controversial and problematic. But they wouldn't say, oh, we have to stop the 20th century Saladin. We have to stop Nasser, because we all know what happened in the Suez crisis, and we all know that happened in the Six-Day War, you know, led by Egypt and Syria and stuff. That's not the frame they will use. Because if they use that frame, first of all, people don't know it, and then it's not as manipulative. So if you say well, Saddam Hussein's actions in Kuwait are like, I don't know, Nasser's in Egypt, or Nasser's in the Six Day War, or it's like Saladin in, the 1100 and stuff. They don't understand that. So going on, so also, why not compare Putin to Stalin? You could make the case his actions in Ukraine resemble Stalin more than Hitler in the Sudetenland, but Stalin is still more morally ambiguous than Hitler. Hitler and Sudetenland is not ambiguous at all for most people. So, for example, yes, Stalin is hated by a lot of people, but also because of things like World War II, Stalin has some credit for some people. And I wouldn't say Stalin's image is as morally is more morally ambiguous. I wouldn't say most people like Stalin, but I would say if you call Putin Stalin, especially because they're both like, well, Stalin was from Georgia, wasn't he? But like both Russian leaders and stuff, then they would just say, oh, like it's just an extension of the USSR. But the goal here is not to paint Putin as the leader of the USSR or the new USSR. It's meant to paint him as the leader of like a new Nazi Germany, and that's the manipulation of the frame. So this is me talking as well. If we learnt the lessons of Sudetenland and Munich, then we must act with force. That's what the media framing of saying Putin is Hitler implies. If we seriously believe Putin is using Eastern Ukraine as a stepping stone to invade the whole of Europe, like that's what we should do, right? Like if we seriously believe that Putin is Hitler, Eastern Ukraine is Sudetenland, and Ukraine is Czechoslovakia, then we must do something. Like, how is this guy going to be deterred by sanctions? Did Munich work with Hitler? We have to do something. And that's how like politicians and the Western media manipulate you into going along with warmongering, basically. The reason Pelosi isn't trying to accurately make a historical comparison is because she wants people to support militaristic actions towards a completely evil and irrational dictator like Putin. Of course, you can support retaliation against Russia and condemn Putin without trying to frame him as Hitler, which in my opinion only increases tensions in the situation. So yeah, that's like generally like obviously what Putin is doing is really, really bad. What Saddam Hussein was doing in the Middle East was like really, really bad, right? But then you can have accurate comparisons and you can even take historical framing, which is more accurate. But what people like to jump to is World War II. And that's the problem with Western media, is because we have this view that we're like the morally righteous ones. So everything Putin does is basically Hitler and World War III. Everything Saddam Hussein did was Hitler and potential World War III starting in the Middle East. Because we all know what happens if we don't stand up to bullies. The ironic part, of course, is Saddam Hussein and Putin were both Western-backed in the first place. Sort of these like Frankenstein's monsters that have massively backfired on the West. Because Yeltsin personally chose Putin. Saddam Hussein was backed by the Americans, French and Saudis to fight the Iranians after the revolution. We gave this guy weapons. Donald Rumsfeld personally met him for Reagan and stuff. Putin, went to the opera with Tony Blair in like 2000. So like this whole, and we're going to get into how the West is like complicit to a degree historically in this mess as well. So now I just want to, spin it around and talk about like historically why Putin is the fault of the West and like the decline of the Soviet Union. So like I'm not trying to make any excuses for how Putin is acting. He's his own individual with his own like nationalistic agenda. Of course, I believe most Russian leaders would hate NATO and would hate NATO expansion, but I think his specific actions today are not just about NATO. And I sincerely believe that. I also think you shouldn't downplay it. And also I 100% reject Putin is invading Ukraine because he wants to denazify the country. Like I've made a couple of videos about Ukraine's problems with neo-Nazis. Now, honestly, I think a lot of people downplay the Nazi element because they're like, well, the Nazis couldn't win the election. They didn't get much of the vote. Therefore, they're not a problem. But the problem in Ukraine is they honor the Nazis from World War II who fought the Soviets. They honor the SS, right? It's a bigger problem than people make out, but at the same time, I don't think it's such a problem, and especially coming from Russia as well, like and their politics, that you can invade and say, oh yeah, we're trying to get rid of the Nazis in Ukraine, because it's not as big a problem that you've got to do something so drastic like that. And like I said, especially coming from like an ultra right leaning country with a nationalist government like Russia. But then like let's get into like how Putin was even able to take power. So some of you, and probably many of you, are familiar with like the IMF and like the World Bank, two institutions set up during the Second World War. basically the goal was to promote like free market capitalism and make sure countries wouldn't go communist. So the reason countries like Japan, Germany, many other countries across the world were pumped full of loads of money from the IMF and World Bank, who also designed these countries' economies, was so they wouldn't turn communist, basically. But what the IMF and World Bank often do is, especially the IMF, the deal you make with them is you get the loans, but you have to privatize your economy. So nationalization gets ended, all these different things you cannot do anymore. And obviously that helps promote oligarchy, that helps promote dictatorships. And it's why Western countries are so happy for IMF to do deals with dictators. Like the whole Arab Spring was an anti-capitalist uprising against a whole region that had been destroyed by the IMF and the US propping up these dictators. So with that in mind, in the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, the IMF came in, and backed by the Americans, of course, and they thought, like, how do we change Russia from, you know, this mainly like nationalized economy, this, you know, communist economy, how do we change that into something that's capitalist? And what their idea is to do shock therapy. Like, I don't know, you're resuscitating someone. And basically what they did was they did this privatization of the economy, but on steroids. And basically what it did, Russia was like a terrible, terrible place to live in the 1990s because the economy was total shit. The economy was actually far, far worse than it was in the dying days of the Soviet Union. I think it was like 50% unemployment or maybe more or something. And that was all down to IMF privatization policies, and privatization policies which gave rise to the Russian oligarchy that is so powerful today. The Russian oligarchy that Putin, of course, relies on for his support and who back him, you know, like Roman Abramovich, the owner of Chelsea, is one of his friends. So the problem was they didn't let the Soviet Union transition from a communist state to like a more capitalist state. They tried to do this like insanely quickly. And what happened is they totally decimated the Russian economy and gave rise to this class. And then Putin obviously emerged at the end of the decade, personally recommended by like Yeltsin and picked by Yeltsin to become the next leader of Russia. And that's how you have this situation today. And of course, there's more stuff like the expansion of NATO and Putin's own nationalistic agenda. But the thing with Putin, he was also friends with the West to start with, and he was backed by people like Tony Blair. So it's like all these things that come back to bite the West is because of poor planning on their respect. Like even if you wanted to help bail out the communist Soviet economy, make Russia capitalist, there would be a better way to go about it than IMF shock therapy. But instead what they did is create the class you see now. And, you know, Russia could be like a fairly prosperous, regulated capitalist economy if it planned it correctly and didn't have these absolute nutcases coming in and trying to privatize everything. But that's what happened, and that's how this stuff has backfired. Anyone supporting Russia is just totally ridiculous. Like, you know, Putin and the oligarchs and everything like that. Roman Abramovich is one of the biggest funder of Israeli settlements, right? He's one of Putin's best friends. Do you think these oligarchs are like some sort of like ghosts of the Soviet Union or some shit? The Soviet Union is dead. Everyone who ran it with good intentions is not in leadership in Russia and hasn't been since, you know, the end of the Soviet Union. So even if you are like a communist and you believe in the Soviet Union and you think the fall of the Soviet Union was like a tragedy and everything like that, then you shouldn't be supporting Russia. Like, you just shouldn't be. Just because it's Russia and the Russia was in the Soviet Union doesn't mean it's the same thing anymore. The hypocrisy of the West goes even deeper in that Boris Johnson is talking about sanctions on Russia. The biggest football club in London, Chelsea, is owned by a Russian oligarch who's friends with Putin. Boris Johnson himself has been personally funded by Russian oligarchs. London is like one of the capital cities for whitewashing criminal Russian money. And we're not tackling that while we're putting sanctions on Russia. It's so like ridiculous, and it just like it. I guess this is how people get radicalized. It feels like, especially as a left-wing person, it feels like you're constantly gaslit by the Western media until like you think you're crazy. And I think some people like genuinely become kind of crazy through the politics, because it's like how can I be watching this news right now? And yes, like the pictures in Ukraine are like I've never seen anything like that in Europe, obviously because I was a kid in the 1990s, so I don't remember this shit. Why don't you like NATO? Okay, so basically, like, I was thinking about this today, right? If we're talking about, let's say Okay, I don't think that NATO should have been disbanded because NATO was a response to the Warsaw Pact, obviously, the USSR led of Eastern militaries against the West, right? So once the Warsaw Pact collapsed and the USSR collapsed, that should have been the end of NATO because NATO was designed to protect Western Europe, for example. It should have just ended, especially because Russia was getting in bed with the West after the end of the communist state. So then what should have happened is it should have gone away. But now, okay, let's say, okay, Russia is a very aggressive country in the region. The problem with NATO still is that this isn't a regional problem. This isn't like Denmark, Germany, Poland, Estonia, and these countries all coming together and being like, we will support each other if one of us gets invaded. The problem is France, the UK, and the United States, which isn't even on the continent, are all in NATO. And that just, to me, escalates the whole problem. It becomes less of a defensive alliance and becomes more of an aggressive alliance because you have a country that is nowhere near Europe, which is part of this alliance. So if you attack France, they get involved. And I don't think, like, for me personally, having the world's biggest superpower as part of a so-called defensive alliance makes much sense. And of course, NATO doesn't just even do stuff in Europe. It attacks other countries across, the world. So with NATO specifically, like, if we're gonna have the conversation that like Central European countries and Eastern European countries should have a defensive alliance against Russia, then why don't we make some sort of European Union army instead of NATO? Like, why don't we replace that? Or why don't we just replace some sort of Central and Eastern European aligned nations things that against Russia, so you can legit make the argument this is for defensive purposes, because combined, especially with like Germany and maybe some other countries, you can easily see how this would repel a Russian invasion. And obviously they'd probably get support from the US, UK and France. And even you could stick France in there if you wanted, because it's on mainland Europe, even though maybe I wouldn't personally do that. So like that can make sense to me. Like, I understand that because Russia is like an aggressive bully, but I also think NATO even existing has created this situation where Russia is more aggressive because of NATO build-up on its border, because what NATO essentially is just the reach of the United States, because the United States is like the biggest member, the controlling member, has the biggest military, far bigger than like all of them combined. So you cannot argue to me that NATO is a defensive alliance against Russia when the United States is included in that. Because Russia, personally, I don't think, does not threaten the United States, but it does threaten Europe. So even if we just took the US out, I'd understand NATO's point a lot more. The US being there completely undermines its like supposed existence as a defensive force. And also the problem is, why are people scared about World War III right now? If the United States wasn't in NATO, if NATO didn't exist, would people be scared of World War III? It's because they're scared that Russia will overreach and attack a NATO country, and then what does the US do? Does the US respond? And then we have World War III, and then we have a massive war between two massive superpowers of nuclear weapons. And that's the problem with NATO. So, and obviously the other problems like invading different countries that aren't even in Europe and stuff like that. Yeah, NATO soldiers from all around Europe contributed to Iraq and Afghanistan. Yeah, how is that to do with Russia? It's just like a massive military alliance that the US controls. Don't ask NATO where the Nazi war criminals went. Yeah, exactly. A lot of the founding members of NATO and a lot of the generals used to be in the Wehrmacht. So yeah, it's interesting to me, like, watching this stuff, and like the West just can't do anything, and they know, and this is what people like Putin know. They know Putin knows him and Russia are up for the fight, and he knows that Western democracies and democracies in general are not up for the fight, because we've had 20 years of the war on terror. Pointless wars, wasting loads of Western lives, killing loads of civilians in the Middle East and in Afghanistan. And he knows now no one wants war. I was talking to my girlfriend about this earlier. If there was a draft in the UK, I don't think anyone would do it. Like, I can't even imagine a scenario where more than like 5,000 people would willingly be drafted to fight a war against Russia. Like, I cannot believe that at all. And 100 years ago, 800,000 British people died fighting World War I. And that's the whole difference now. And also, you see with the American conservative movement, they're backing Putin. That's such a massive change from 20 years ago, where the neocons would want to go to war with anyone. North Korea, Libya, Iran, Iraq. They wanted to fight all these countries. And now the conservative movement in America, led by like the Tucker Carlsons and Donald Trump, they support Putin. But then you have the Democrats. The Democrats aren't going to go to war with Putin. So the side that was more militaristic in the US who wanted a fight, they now support the people they're meant to be fighting. So I cannot see this appetite for war ever returning in the Western countries. But I think Russia obviously has this appetite for war for like nationalistic reasons, in some ways national security reasons as well. And I think China do as well. But the problem is as well, Ukraine is on Russia's border. Taiwan, historically, since like, was it like the 1600s, was a part of the Chinese Empire. Taiwan is close to China. Taiwan even says they are part of China, right? So if China invades Taiwan, what American wants to go die for Taiwan? What American, what British person, what French person, what German person wants to go die for Taiwan? And to a lesser extent, Ukraine. Like, Ukraine is a bit different. But I cannot see a scenario where Western countries who are far removed, I'm not talking about all NATO members, especially the ones who like border Ukraine and stuff. I'm talking about Western countries like France, Britain, and the UK. I cannot see a scenario where the civilian population would go along with a war against these countries. I just cannot see it. And then Putin, Xi Jinping, they know this, and that's what they're going to take advantage of. And it shows the decline of the US, because with China rising, like, Russia is not rising, it's been declining since the Soviet days, but they still have a very powerful military and a big nuclear arsenals, and that's why they can get away with doing stuff like this. But China is an even worse scenario, because I was reading today that the Germans and the French don't want to sanction Russia as much as the Americans and the British because of how much business dealings they have with each other. So think about that with China, right? If China invades Taiwan, and obviously I expect the US to do nothing despite, you know, kind of defense agreements with Taiwan, what countries are going to want to sanction China? Like, I don't think even less countries are going to want to sanction China, and they're so more pivotal to the world economy as well. So I find that like really interesting. But then I also read today the Prime Minister of Pakistan is meeting Putin today, and he's backing Putin. Pakistan has historically been in bed with the British and the Americans, and now they're in bed more with the Russians, and the Indians already have been historically quite involved with Russia, and most weapons bought by India are bought from Russia. So it's like this, you know, I've said before what I would want. I don't want a new Cold War. I don't want China versus the America as like the dominating superpowers. I would rather, like, is it called like a multipolar world? So I'd rather have like the EU, Russia, China, Brazil, India, and like other emerging economies and like powerful economies like that, and like North America to like balance each other out, and maybe like hopefully one day African countries as well. Under global capitalism, I don't really see that happening, but it's just interesting to see that happening. Like, if Russia tried this 20 years ago, do you think the response would be a bit more militaristic? Maybe it would, but the Middle East wars and everything like that, I think, have really sapped the desire for conflict from Western countries. Well, I just learned the Kavernacle is educated. Yeah, master's degree. But here's, okay, someone, I don't know if that's sarcastic, but here's the problem as well, right? So obviously I have a master's degree in international relations, and I definitely do not claim to be an expert on international relations, nor do I claim to be an expert on like Russia, Ukraine. And the problem is, and I made this point at the start, people on Twitter who acted like they predicted this happening don't know what they're fucking talking about, and they're just not humble enough to admit it. You guys know this in your own life. Some of the people who are the most confident in their wrong opinions, or just confident in their opinions and stuff, don't actually know what they're talking about. Because if you do know what you're talking about, you'll be more humble because you'll recognize where the limits of your knowledge are, and you won't start bragging. Like, I wasn't on Twitter like Hassan writing like, Putin will not ever invade, you're a dumbass, blah 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 blah, because like I'm not confident enough to say that. Like, obviously personally I felt like he wouldn't, but I'm not confident enough to go around like lecturing people about this stuff. So yeah, like the biggest thing for me having education is you realize how much you don't know is the main thing. And the less educated you are sometimes, or maybe it's like a humbleness thing, like you just think you're smarter than you are. So anyway, that is it for the video. Thanks for sticking with this one. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you want to follow me on social media, at the Kavernacle on Twitter and Instagram, come join my subreddit. Check out my Patreon if you want to support my work. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.